Gonna give it a couple of minutes for people to trickle in. Looks like we have some people. Good morning or good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the Reduced Shakespeare Company podcast likes to open their podcast, depending on what time zone you're on. Hope everyone is having a nice October day. Welcome to Rainbow Space Magic Con 4.0. This is the Respect Your Elders Aging in Speculative Fiction panel. Before we introduce ourselves, I want to go over a few logistics. You're welcome to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations in a respectful manner. If you'd like to submit a question to the panel, we request that you put a question mark before the question, so it's obvious for us to see that you are asking. There'll be time for questions in the second half, but feel free to write them as you think of them. After the panel, the conversation will continue in the Discord. With that in mind, it is just two of us. So rather than let me introduce myself. My name is Angie Sutton. In my spare time, I am a freelance journalist that covers geeky media and geeky culture. I write primarily for the geeky area, although I have my own website, angiefsutton.com, where I also produce a podcast where I interview geeky people about geeky things. Next up is Catherine.
Hi, that's a lot of geeky. Anyway, I'm Catherine Lundoff. I'm an author, editor, and I'm the publisher at Queen of Swords Press, which is a small press publishing company based in Minneapolis that specializes in science fiction, fantasy, and horror with queer protagonists. And I am best known for these two books, Silver Moon and Blood Moon. What do you ask are these about? They are about a pack of menopausal werewolves. And that pertains very much to why I do these panels and why I talk about them.
I was going to say, since it is just two of us, rather than me like moderating, quote unquote, I figured we'd just handle this more like a conversation. So attendees, feel free to chime in whenever you want. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to kind of keep the questions going. But for the first question, you were the one that kind of suggested this idea. I'm on the volunteer committee, so I know that. What prompted you to suggest that as a topic?
Well, so when I first wrote Silver Moon, when it first started coming out, I realized just how few characters over the age of 40 who didn't fall into a bucket of stereotypes within the genre that there were. And so you've got, evil old women are, the wicked queen, the wicked witch. You've got the mom characters who are quickly written off the page. They just kind of, go poof in that way that mom characters do in fantasy and science fiction. But there was very little representation. So the book originally came out with a previous publisher before I re-released it in 2017. So I've been working on this since about 2012. So I started compiling a bibliography, which started out on my blog, is now out on Goodreads. There's a whole couple of hundred, recommendations that people have made. And I started doing a lot more talks at conventions, on panels and so forth, because I wanted people to start thinking about it. And one of the things that comes out of there about queer characters specifically is that for a lot of us growing up, we didn't necessarily, if you came out as a teenager, or even in your 20s, you didn't necessarily know older queer folks. I came out in 1986 at the height of the AIDS crisis. So, the relationship with elders was very different because they were endangered essentially, in a lot of cases. And so when you get into more internet spaces and so forth, you get generations of folks who may not have really interacted with queer elders because they've got, their fandom, their pod, their Discord channel, whoever it is that they hang out with. So one of the things that I think is important to talk about representation, queer characters, older women, older queer people, is that it's a way to show people that they have a future. And I think that that's really important. I mean, some of it is, about me personally. I actually want to read about characters that are more like me. I don't always want to be reading, coming out narratives are really important. It's really great that they're there. There should be more of them. But I don't always necessarily want to read the teen coming out story. Been there, done that. I want to see more characters like myself. Want to see more characters having adventures, over the age of 40. I want to see more, different kinds of worlds, different kinds of possibilities, different ways of being in both the world that we're in and the worlds we can imagine. So that was how I got into this. And so this has been kind of the decade-long quest since 2012 as I've gone through, building the bibliography, working on stuff, I'm working on the third book in the series. Yeah, and that was pretty much where it all began.
I was going to say, women typically go into the three archetypes: maid, mother, and crone, and it's nice to see that, especially you are breaking out of that mode. One of the things I've been trying to pitch an article about fangirling over 40, about the ageism as on top of the sexism of how if you're over 40, you're kind of looked down upon by being a fan now. And you should be, quote unquote serious, but you never see that about men. And so one of the things is probably representation, is that there aren't that many women in that mid-age range for it. So tell me a little bit more about your books and how that goes into the middle age. They're obviously, if they're menopausal, they're middle age, and where that came from.
Okay. One thing I did want to mention quick, we talked about this a little bit before we got in the chat, but in terms of representation within fandom, there's a book that came out a year or two back called Geek Elders Speak from Forest Path Books. And it's a series of short essays and interviews with women who were originally active in Kirk Spock fandom. And there's some other later fandoms in there, but it's a lot of it is about, the folks who were around at the beginning of time, first, being out in fandom, being older in fandom, aging through fandom, and what that looks like. So, there's beginning to be some more resources, but I agree, there's definitely, nowhere near as much as you would think there would be by this point. So my own books. Okay. So I got invited to write a story for a werewolf anthology way back in 2009, I think. And I was looking around and I wanted to do something different. And it needed to be, lesbian werewolves. And I'm like, okay, fine, great. And I started looking at the representation that I could find of female werewolves in the field. And at the time, it was weighing in very heavily on teenagers who got bitten at first menses. That was a really popular one. A couple of other things, one or two like born into werewolf packs things, but everybody very firmly under 20. And so I was poking around online, and I stumbled into the wilds of one of those online diagnose your ailment sort of sites, and it had this whole section on the symptoms of menopause, which included things like unexpected hair growth, things, longer teeth because your gums recede. And I went, you know what that sounds like? Started poking around, went back to my editor and said, how about I write a novella about menopausal werewolves? My editor said, wow, do the thing. So I wrote the original novella, and stuff happened. The book kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And several of my friends had read the novella, and they were all like, you really need to do something longer with this. This needs to be a book. So I started writing the novel. And ironically, the first edition of the novel and the novella came out at the same time because it was like a 2-year delay. It was a while. Anyway, so I started, talking about Silver Moon, which is book 1, is about a woman named Becca Thornton. She is 50 years old. She is, as far as she knows, straight. She's recently divorced, and she's trying to kind of make sense of her world. And she discovers that as she's beginning to develop symptoms of menopause, she's also turning into a werewolf. Then she discovers that there's a whole community of middle-aged female werewolves in this town. So she starts to, she has a crush on her lesbian neighbor who's also a werewolf. And so the first book is about Becca kind of figuring herself out. It's about found family, coming out at midlife, and of course, werewolves. Book 2, which is Blood Moon, picks up where book book one leaves off, and that one is about it's from Becca and Erin, who's her crush, and by this point also her partner. It's about their relationship and their perspective of what's going on and the next series of adventures that they're having. I'm currently working on book 3, which is going to be called Blue Moon, and hope to have that out in the not too distant future, but not this year.
We have a quick request if you can repeat the title of that Aging in Fandom book.
It's called Geek Elders Speak.
I knew I had it in my brain. I'll put it in the chat
cool.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things when we were discussing what panels to put on, I wanted to call this, older people exist too,
Because that's not defensive at all.
Exactly. No, because again, it's all about representation. It helps that people want to read about people that are like themselves. So talk a little bit more about the representation of the older people in speculative fiction.
Okay. So I, was poking around and going, okay, well, I surely cannot have been the first person to have thought of this. And spoiler alert, in fact, I was. Somebody may have thought of it, but they didn't actually put it out in story or book form. So I started poking around to see what else was out there, and I began building this bibliography. And I found a couple of things. There's, one, of course, a lot of stereotyping of older characters, particularly older women, but, older queer characters as well. Older gay men don't fare all that well either in a lot of these things. There's still not a lot of older trans representation, and I'll talk about that a little later in the context of the field and what gets published and so forth. So you've got some things that are that are very clearly about older women going and doing things, whether that's a quest or they're having various kinds of adventures. It's not queer, but they're very much kind of a germinal series. Nancy Springer, now best known for the Enola Holmes mysteries, originally back in the 90s wrote a series about several divorced women having various adventures, and it's Fair Peril. Lark on the Wing is the one with the most queer content, and her magical power is that she discovers that she splits into different people, and one of the people that she becomes is a young gay man at the height of the AIDS crisis, navigating what's going on around him and the very real danger that he's in, as well as the magic and how that affects her. And it's a really interesting take on it. It won a number of awards when it came out. Lark is spelled Larque. So that one is an interesting one to check out for representation. It holds up pretty well. The other couple of books, Plumage and Fair Peril, have different spins on the whole discussion of aging. Anyway, so one of the things that I found was that older characters punch above their weight. And what I mean by that is when you ask for recommendations, one, people always recommend the same 2 or 3 things, because of course you will not have thought about Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon, because you have never, ever, ever heard of it. And even though 15 other people on the same list have just recommended it, it's still going to be new information. So that's one thing. So you always get the same 2 or 3 books. Then the other part of it is that I pushed really hard when I was developing the bibliography. I'm like, okay, let's talk about protagonists. And you will get people insisting that in an ensemble cast of 12 characters, an older woman who has a walk-on role for about 10 pages is a protagonist. So there's this sense of like outsized presence. If there's any representation at all, it's practically like having a main character, and it's kind of not. So it's been really interesting kind of talking with people about that and trying to kind of weed out some of that, because it's a very definite take on things. And when a nice fan I met in Helsinki took my original list and put it out on Goodreads. And so I don't actually control what's on the Goodreads list. so people can add things. And there's definitely some books out there where I'm like, yes, there is a woman over, 50 or a queer person over 50, who's on for about 10 pages and then they're gone, but to you, that's enough to make it a protagonist. To me, it's not. It's not the experience I'm looking for. I want a central character who's around for at least half the time, to really engage the kind of story that I'm looking for. So that's some of the stuff that I've kind of run across in the course of doing this. And it's been interesting to see different takes on it. And do you want to talk a little bit about what happens as creators get older?
Yeah, sure.
Because that's okay. So one of the things that you can't always tell how old a creator is, and often it's a bad idea to go and find out. Just leave it alone. But if people are open about being in their 50s or 60s, that's one thing. But if people are not and would rather you did not discuss their work as though they were in their 50s and 60s, only to find out they're 35, makes for a little bit of awkwardness at conventions and whatnot. But one of the things that's been happening is that as creators have aged, and I'm mostly talking about writers here, but it's not just writers, as there's more women in the field, and there's more women who have managed to develop a long enough career that they've gone from being writers in their 20s and 30s until they're in their 50s and 60s, is that they're more comfortable writing older characters as they age. I was on a panel with Connie Willis at Worldcon a few years ago, and one of the things that she brought up was when she was in her 30s, she wouldn't have been able to sell a story about an older protagonist. She couldn't have written that work, and now she can, because she is now the older protagonist of her own life. So there's been a sea change on that. There's been a very gradual shift where it's possible to sell books with older protagonists. Right at the moment, again, unfortunately not queer, and we'll get back to that in a second. I'm reading Shannon Chakraborty's The Adventures of Amin al-Sarafi. And it's about a middle-aged Muslim female pirate ship captain who assembles her old crew for one last job. And it's brilliant. I mean, it's a really brilliant book. Pretty sure that Chakraborty is younger than her protagonist, but I don't know for sure, so I'm not going to worry about it. But it's a book that you would not have seen on the shelves 10 years ago. And that's a combination of it being, about a Muslim protagonist, about an older woman who's a mother, who's, fulfilling a traditional male role. Ship's pirate captain goes back for one last gig. There's just not that much representation of women doing that or queer people doing that. However, with that, you have queer representation and work by queer authors and a focus on queer authors. And I'm using queer as the little rainbow gift wrap basket of all of us here for shorthand. That it's very cyclical. So I got into fandom in the 80s. When I got into fandom, there was a core group of out queer writers. So you have people like Joanna Russ and Samuel Delaney, Melissa Scott, Laurie Marks, Elizabeth, I'll look it up later. Elizabeth Lynn, so a couple of other folks, Jewel Gomez. And it's, there's kind of a core group, and there's a few people, around them, and they've got books that are getting some major attention, some major play out there. And you kind of coast into the 90s, and most of those people's careers go splat for a variety of reasons. And you don't have replacements. So there's like a whole subset of years where if you look at the Tor Books catalog, and I'm just going to pick on Tor because they're fun to pick on, there's the only lesbian or queer women's representation you can find is written by straight guys. And they're all the same writing group. They all the same thing. So I mean, it wasn't that these were bad stories, but in terms of what we would now call own voices, which was not really, the term we used back then for it, that representation wasn't there. So if you wanted something that, felt differently to you as a queer person than it might feel to you if you were reading it as a straight person. You weren't necessarily going to find that through the big presses. You would find that in smaller presses. And so then we kind of, fast forward a few more years and things start to pick up again. There's like another whole period of time where, if you wanted to read about a gay male protagonist, it pretty much had to be written by a cis woman. If you wanted to read about, a queer protagonist, there was, if you wrote about a character who fell into the same general bucket as the one you identified with, it seemed to be perceived as being autobiographical. It's just super annoying. I should mention that I also have a series out on queer sci-fi that's a decade by decade survey up through 2010 of the trends in the field and representation within LGBTQ plus science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I stopped at 2010 because at that point things just go poo, and there's just too much to keep track of, and so it would be a matter of just going through and doing the high points. So when you get into the mid 2000s and you work your way up toward 2010 and beyond, you get a lot more representation. But because a lot of the people who'd been around before were backburnered for a variety of reasons, they're just not, they're publishing, but they're not publishing to the big press anymore. So you get a lot of people who are new authors. So they get novellas, they get short stories, but they don't get full-length books. And that's only been changing fairly recently, where you're also, not only are we getting, trans reps that we never had before, but we're also seeing, a Muslim ship's captain, who's a middle-aged woman, we're seeing a lot of stuff that we wouldn't have seen, 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. International authors, many more authors of color than the field has had before, authors who are not based in the US. There's been a lot of stuff that's changing that. So with that, we're also getting more and different kinds of queer reps. So now, when I came out in 1986, there were many fewer letters in the various acronyms, and so it wasn't that people didn't exist and identify as different flavors of queer, but there wasn't a vocabulary to talk about it, which means that there also wasn't work representing that. And if you were a writer and you were trying to do it, well, how do you do that if you don't have the words for it? You end up coding it in different ways. So that's kind of some of the stuff that I've seen, over my time in the field. I started publishing in '97, so I've been around about that long. But before that, I was a fan for a good, 10, 15 years. I read things, I went to conventions and so forth. And,
well, you mentioned
tracking the field.
You are a publisher yourself, but what about other publishers? Do you think there's a stigma against older characters that they're not just publishing them, that people are submitting it, they're just not publishing it?
I mean, bear in mind that in general, small presses have a very high attrition rate. We're just kind of toddling around out there watching the hit points go down all the time. So, for example, I have been publishing books since 2017, so that's 6.5 years, during which time I have watched at least 10 other presses implode. Some of them started the same time I did, some of them started afterwards. So you've got, weighing against, can you sell a book with older characters to a queer press? You've got things like what our reach is like, what kind of audience we can tap into. Can we sell the book? Because if we can't sell the book, it does no one a service to take it. That's the thing. So it's not, I think there's stuff out there, but a lot of the stuff is, it's self-published, it's indie published stuff. There are some other works. So Forest Path Books, I've already mentioned, does do some queer stuff, does do some older rep. Tachyon, which is good-sized, medium-sized press. If you've heard of them recently, you may have heard of them because of a novella called Bruising the Kiowa. which has gotten lots and lots of award buzz in the last year. But they're great press, really solid, put out a lot of good books. They've been publishing books by R.B. Lemberg, who is a trans author who's working with older trans characters. So For Profound Weaves has some representation, and I think I'm going to use there because I don't remember exactly which pronoun is quite the right one. And then their next one also has some older queer rep. So there's starting to be more stuff out there. In terms of, how you get there, a lot of it is to do with, your platform and what you can convince a publisher can be sold, because that is definitely part of the name of the game. Because publishers who don't sell books don't stick around very long, which is part of the whole attrition rate thing. But yeah, there's starting to be more, but some of it is, getting to a point where, as with women authors writing older women, getting to a point where there are enough older queer authors in a position to write older queer characters and see them published.
Well, this is kind of delving into one of the panels that we had yesterday on writing your true self and authentic identities. As a publisher yourself, what are some of the things that you are looking for in terms of making sure that that voice is authentically older, I guess is the best?
Well, bearing in mind that, I'm publishing a wide range of authors, and some of them do older characters and some of them don't. I think that, there's some things that they feel right. I remember the first time I read a character that really felt older to me. There's a writer named Robin Wayne Bailey who he still writes short stories and so forth. I think he's had some health issues, but hopefully he'll come back and do some more work. But he did this series about a woman warrior who goes out and does all the things that women warriors of the 1980s do. Except he made a really interesting choice, and as the books move forward, she ages. So by the time you get up to book 3, she's retired. She's running an inn. She gets up in the morning and she creaks and things hurt and she gets tired faster. And, somebody out of her past comes looking for her, kills her family, and she's heading back out. She's got to go find the magical weapon. She's got to go recreate the legend that she used to be, except that, she's now in her mid-40s and life just feels different. There's things that are, just much, you don't even think about it when you're in your 20s, but you're definitely going to think about it in your 40s because you just don't bounce as well. You hit the ground, maybe you're getting back up, maybe you're not. So especially when you're talking about something as action heavy as science fiction and fantasy, I think that's also part of why you have less rep of older characters, is because the assumption is that you are going out and you are fighting the dragon, or you are, doing whatever it is that is very active. And the assumption is that an older character couldn't keep up. I mean, if you look, for example, at Lord of the Rings, the amount of time that Gandalf spends wandering off someplace else off camera, imprisoned, presumed dead, is pretty high. I mean, he shows up, he does mentory things for a bit, some of which are, and then he's gone, best of luck at making it through these haunted mines that probably have a monster in them. Have fun. Who does that? And I'm not knocking Lord of the Rings. I like the book a lot, but there's a tendency to either kill off older mentor characters or to send them off elsewhere so they are not underfoot with troublesome advice and things like that. And YA is of course notorious for this, where you wipe out the parents, so the parents are kidnapped,
dead mom,
or dead mom. There's just, more than I can even count of, dead mom, otherwise missing parent, parents who for whatever reason are off, have gallivanting, doing something else, but they're definitely not paying attention to what you're doing. And I think there's a real trend, that you can see looking at how older characters get represented and the kind of roles that older characters fit into. And that's one of the things that happens a lot with older mentor characters is they have to get disappeared because otherwise they know too much. But then again, can they keep up with you when you're fighting whatever it is? So that I think is some of it is just looking for that certain level of realism while staying in touch with a character who really wants to have that adventure. They really want to go on this quest. It's something they want to do, or they have a sense of obligation and they feel like they need to go along and keep the other characters out of trouble, as the case may be. But something that engages them, that feels like they are really a part of this group and they're not just going to get disappeared, over the course of whatever the particular adventure is.
I'm reading a Camelot and Vine. It's a story about a 40-something-year-old woman in Hollywood who somehow time slips into Camelot times, and she definitely, the author Patricia Burchard, definitely uses her age to mention the time period is obviously different, and but she, part of the reason she ran away from Hollywood is because she's not getting any younger, and Hollywood is not exactly focused on old, especially older women, and whatnot, which goes back again to representation. In terms of if you're not older yourself, what would you recommend? I mean, we talked a little bit about making sure that your body is aging, but talk a little bit about some of the tips and tricks that you would do if you're not writing your own self, but writing someone else who happens to be older than you.
I think that it's a good idea to, look at what older writers have written. I think that it's a good idea to talk to older writers if you've got some available, if you've got, someone who's willing to look stuff over and let that seems like something one would do at a younger age. That's definitely going to be helpful. And I think, what you're aiming for is believability. So, is the reader going to bounce out of this and wonder why I am reading about this person doing this thing that, highly unlikely. So usually the problem is that when you've got an older character doing something that feels highly unlikely, it's because it feels highly unlikely. It's not necessarily about the older character. It's just because that character stands out. That's the wall you're going to hit. So you're looking at something where, I mean, I just, this is an example. I was reading a mystery recently, and the protagonist makes many ill-advised decisions, but one of them is palling around with this friend who is just like an absolute dipshit. And the author keeps talking about, how smart they are, what a genius they are. And I'm like, this is not represented in the text. I'm just saying. There's a whole series of really, really, really bad decisions going up to this point. So it's not so much about the age of the character as the character is doing things that are over the top, dumb and or self-destructive. And the protagonist's response to this, and the protagonist is, mid-30s, the protagonist's response to this is, let's see what geniuses do. And I'm like, no, no, you got to do better than that. There are certainly reasons people do things like this, but, you have to sell it, so it's a question of what can your narrative sell? What kind of story can it sell? What kind of motivation can it sell? And there's going to be some things that are just simply going to be, more believable than others. And there's also a lot of, the genre is what it is, and there's a lot of hand wavium. We just kind of gloss over it, and we mention this briefly, and then we go on and we go do this other thing. It's like magic, as it were. And that's a narrative, and it's got an audience, and maybe you don't have to delve too deeply into the motivations to have the representation. It depends on the kind of story you're telling, the kind of audience you're hoping to reach, and what you're going to do with it.
feel free to put any questions in the chat or use the Q&A section. We've got about 20 minutes left, give or take. Just wanted to put that in. I had a question and then I lost it. Of course, age.
It couldn't just be being tired from doing back-to-back panels or anything like that.
Exactly. It was something to do with authentic voices. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I heard a beep. I thought it was us. It was something else. It was something to do with authentic voices. Oh, yeah, that was what it was more of a. This is more of a comment than a question. um, that with when writing any authentic voice, make sure that it's more that they just happen to be older rather than that be the sole part of their identity. I mean, obviously for you, for the werewolf ones, it was pretty vital that they're of a certain age because menopause doesn't come any younger. But at the same time, I'm sure she has more that's not her being menopausal isn't the sole source of her character, right?
No, so other stuff happens.
So,
quite a bit actually.
exactly. So, I am starting to blank, so I apologize. It's been a day. Talk a little bit more about, you mentioned briefly about, the older queers and how that is also a concern. Obviously, like you said, with the AIDS epidemic, part of the problem is that, for a generation, there isn't that many older queers to begin with, because unfortunately, a lot of them died out. So, talk a little bit more about maybe how that might be part of that's now starting to change, thankfully, and how that might be why that trend might be starting to progress.
Well, I mean, bear in mind that, what we think of now as the AIDS epidemic had a disproportionate impact on gay men, bi men, queer men, but mostly people who are male identified, and you don't get that many women who have AIDS and HIV until you get a little further along into the epidemic. It does happen, and there were probably ones who were, who contracted it earlier, but were not included because the focus was so much on queer men. But in and of itself, that right there had a and a really outsized cultural impact in terms of the stories that were told. However, most lesbians, did not contract AIDS or HIV. Some bi women did. So it wasn't that it wasn't like a magical shield overall. But what was happening within the different spheres of publishing is that you had a number of gay men who were kind of they were published with the big presses. They did things like memoirs. They did eventually you get into people like Larry Kramer and so forth writing about the AIDS epidemic specifically. But prior to that, you have, some prominent gay authors who were published by like Christopher Street Editions and some other things like toward the top of the food chain. So you lose that representation and you lose what would have, come out further down. But there were also a substantial number of queer focused, medium-sized and small presses. And you get that from like the late 70s all the way through, arguably the advent of the internet and the rise of Amazon. And a lot of that has to do with books distribution and some other stuff that's outside the scope of this panel. But so you've got a number of lesbians and queer women and feminists, straight feminists who are writing books about women, who are writing books that center women's stories. However, they're, many of them are not queer or they're not science fictional. So we don't necessarily remember them the same way, but there's like this whole, subset of things. And then as you get into the 90s, one of the things that happens is you have this absolute blossoming of online fandom. One of the things that comes out of that is Dina Gabrielle fandom, huge impact on getting more lesbian and queer women's voices out there, but very, very, very romance focused. So you've got a whole bunch of queer romances, some of which have science fictional elements to them, but we would probably not necessarily call them all science fiction simply because that's not what the primary story is about. You could take these two women and drop them in a bar in Poughkeepsie and they would still be doing the same things they're doing. It's just that here they're doing it with, you know, a small dragon or maybe a unicorn or a spaceship or something. So it's, you know, you get the kind of work that comes out of fan fiction is a little different from the kind of stuff that you get with people who came into fandom by reading what was there already available. You get a different spin on it, you get a different take on it, and you get a, you know, it focuses on a different audience. So, you know, you got, you know, elements of that going on, and, you know, there were like tons and tons and tons of books and bunches of publishers, and there were bookstores, and, you know, some of the things we're starting to see come back again. But coming, you know, out of the 60s and 70s, you know, it's worth remembering that in most places, now that we're revisiting it, that it was illegal and or deeply hazardous in a variety of ways to be out and queer. So as you go into the 60s and 70s, you have this massive pushback against that, and you have, you know, people developing book distribution networks and publishing houses and bookstores and a whole bunch of things to get their stories out, to get the different kinds of stories that they want to tell that center queer lives in a variety of ways. And so that's kind of a big, you know, it's a big sea change. It doesn't necessarily, you know, some of it, there's always lag time for how long it takes before, you know, the big publishers in New York suddenly discover a certain kind of narrative, and that a certain kind of narrative has a substantial audience. So, you know, you get things, but you get things that are like, you know, the wave in the 80s, which, you know, was mostly women. And you didn't get the same kind of, other than, you know, Jeff Ryman and a couple of others, you don't really get the same kind of prominent gay men at that, in that, you know, circle at the more popular, the more widely distributed books. And that doesn't come along till later. The other thing you don't see much of is that there's not a lot of science fiction and fantasy that actively deals with the AIDS crisis. And you get things where if there's a gay male character with AIDS, that's a death sentence. And that continues for quite a while. So if they're there for, you know, motivating the straight character to really, you know, recognizing that they're a jerk, or they're there for some sort of, you know, dramatic poignancy, but they're not necessarily three-dimensional characters. And with the exception of, you know, Clive Barker and Jeff Ryman and some of the other gay men who came out of that, you don't get very many narratives that are specifically about the AIDS crisis and its impact on the community. You get a ton of it in literary fiction, you get a ton of it in memoir and biography, you get a fair amount in mystery, but very little in science fiction and fantasy. And there's a bunch of things that go into that. Some of the queer presses did publish books that dealt with it. Vampirism, Common Metaphor. So you get like Allison books and some other things that were actually dealing with that. But in terms of the bigger presses, you just don't really see that. And, you know, that, you know, it's definitely kind of this like weird space in the narrative where, you know, you can tell where the voices are missing. You know, you can tell where those stories are missing, because you would expect, you know, like, I mean, we're going to be reading COVID stories for bloody ever the next few years, you know, because people are living through it and they're going to be writing about it and they're going to come up with metaphors for it, and there's going to be plague books and more plague books, you know, and that's coming. But we don't have that same thing around the AIDS crisis because of the various things that were particular to that.
Well, and speaking of vampires, Kitten Mama has a question. Do vampires count as older characters? They don't age, but they have longevity.
It depends. People always ask that question. You know, it depends on the character. Is it important that the character is older? You know, if it's not important that the vampire is older and they're just kind of, you know, running around behaving like Tom Cruise on a bender, you know, I don't know. That doesn't feel like a genuinely older character to me. That feels like a monster doing monster things. And that's outside the realms of human. So that for me doesn't count the same way. So.
Well, and also you can add the aging to it too. I'm thinking of Claudia from Interview, in terms of that, you know, she was always a forever young character, but they did definitely make her character age in terms of her personality. So
yeah, and you can do that, yeah. But
now,
most authors writing vampire fiction don't get that level of leeway where they're going to get that many books about the same characters that they can actually age them from book to book, which is another whole factor that has to do with what gets published and what doesn't.
and then I'm thinking of some other other immortals where they just don't die. Usually they still look quote unquote young, so that could also be an interesting concept. Is that I think is it Gulliver's Travels where the immortals actually age physically as well, and that I still remember how much that bothered me, the idea of if you grow older, you're going to grow older kind of thing. If you're going to live forever, your body's not going to necessarily keep up with it.
Yep.
So
Yep.
we've got about 4 minutes left for any last thoughts, and then we'll talk into like how people can find us.
Okay. Check out what's out there with older characters. I think you posted the book list. And so that's a jumping off point. Like I said, it's a mixed bag. There are older queer characters, older straight characters. So there's not a gigantic amount out there, but it's worth asking yourself if you're not seeing something, why you're not seeing it. So, for example, if what you want to read about is an older disabled queer character who's not magically cured but still has adventures, and you're not seeing that story and nobody else around you is seeing that story, then maybe that's a story that you want to tell. So looking at things like what's there already, where the possibilities are, because there's so many things out there that could be told that don't really have stories for them or don't really have current good stories for them. So it's worth looking at what that looks like in terms of what you're looking for and what you'd like to read. And if that's yourself in a book, then what does that mean to you?
Okay. And then where can people find you in terms of if they want more? Obviously, you'll also post your links in the self-promotion chat, but for the people who are paying attention to this channel, where can they find you?
CatherineLundoff.net is my personal website. QueenofSwordsPress.com is my publishing website. And we're everywhere. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram, we're on Blue Sky and Mastodon and Facebook. So yeah, Queen of Swords Press. And we publish some really great stuff. So please come check us out. Obviously, of course, my books are terrific, but we have other terrific authors too, just saying. And if you're particularly interested in older characters in rep, Heather Rose Jones has a lovely retelling of Beauty and the Beast with an aromantic protagonist called The Language of Roses. That's one of the books that we published. That's one of the good stuff.
Okay, and while I talk about where people can find me, if there are any further questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the QA. We've got about 2 minutes left. I am found on my website, angiefsutton.com. That's ANGIEFSUTTON.com. All of my social media channels are there, but I am on Blue Sky, whatever we're calling Twitter nowadays, Facebook, Mastodon, Tumblr.
Mostly.
But all of those are linked on my website. I also have a podcast where occasionally I have a sub focus of the podcast where I interview quote unquote geek girls, where one of the conversations inevitably turns into women and aging in the fandom and how that affects their fandom. I guess is fangirling. Kind of thing. So without further ado, we've got a few more, like 1 more minute left, but no more questions. So let me see if there's any final questions. Thank you very much for participating in Rainbow Space Magic, Respect Your Elders, Aging in Speculative Fiction. We have one more panel here, as well as another section of readings. Again, please go back to the Discord and continue the conversation there. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.